I'm going to hit record and we're going to get started. So this first question, thank you, Liesl. I appreciate that. That's teamwork. Thank you for the thumbs up. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this first question. I'm going to ask Renee for you to respond to this question first. And so I'd really like to just ask you to start us off by talking a little bit about this connection between data science and justice. This is something I feel like we're hearing a lot more about recently, but is something that I don't think that's new, right? Could you talk to us a little bit about that? You're muted, Renee.
Muted, yes. Thank you so much, Siri, for including me in this conversation. Mayor, thank you for being a part of it. And of course, everyone who's listening, thank you for joining us. When we think about data and justice, I think we're talking about, if we want to just keep it as simple, data is about measurement. Data is about being counted. Data is about every voice being heard. And now when we think about data, we're thinking about data and democracy and data and due process and data and equity, and of course, diversity and inclusion. So we want to take a justice-oriented approach to data because data is really about the ways in which we include, who do we exclude. So when we think about it in that context of representation and bringing visibility to maybe the underrepresented and unrepresented, we understand the power of data. What we're seeing, particularly when it comes to AI ethics and data ethics, is the fact that algorithms have the opportunity now to really make the kinds of decisions that are really transforming much of our system. So when we think about concepts such as algorithmic justice or algorithmic injustice, and we think about the ways in which we are using data to build algorithmic decision-making systems, then we understand the relationship between data and justice and why we've got to be so diligent and of course vigilant when it comes to the kinds of policies that we're creating and the kinds of ways in which we are thinking about data. So when we think about data justice at the moment, we've got to reimagine data for us to really stretch now the imagination of new and emerging technologies such as AI.
Thank you, Renee.
Sure.
I really appreciate that. I'd love to hear from you, Mayor Walker, about data justice in a community setting, right? Because sometimes when we're talking about these policies or we're talking about these things, it feels very big. But what about data and justice here? Where you live.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. One of the things, even before I was elected to the position, that we worked really hard on was, acknowledging who was in control of the data and what that meant for the programs that were created in Charlottesville. Coming from a nonprofit background, you interact daily with the individuals who think they understand what the data means. And you see the abuses of it from them telling the story they want to portray, which is not always the truth. And that has been a fight that I've been fighting since my nonprofit work here begun. You really begin to understand how people abuse and manipulate it. During my time on council, there are three things that's popping in my head right now. Dr. Holly Edwards, she was not doing well physically. She knew that she didn't have much time left on earth. And she said, I'm going to go back to get my PhD. We have to control the narrative. We have to understand the data better so that we can influence how it's been used so that it serves us best. And I thought and said to her, why, when you know that it's being abused and manipulated, which you already know that fact, why do you have to go back, get this PhD to prove that? It wasn't even everything I thought I understood about it. It wasn't until my time on council and having individuals fight me, it's still not created, like creating an office of performance measurements. The reason that the first Black female police chief was fired, implementing those data practices and taking action on it and being very transparent to the community about, okay, here's the investigative detentions. This is what this looks like. Now we're going to monitor officers' discretion, and this is what that looks like. And we might let some of those officers go who there's a trend, and we're not going to wait for that trend to show up for 5 or 10 years. We can take immediate action. And seeing the response to that, which resulted in her termination from taking that action, attempting to be swift in this way that people say, oh, show me the data. And then you show them the data. And then because it's not the narrative that they are in control of, the way that you are penalized for it. So I have tons of stories, but those are, some that come to mind about how it can be used to transform, and fully understanding from my time how it has been used to abuse systems and the people who need those systems to work.
I love that. And that's a really great bridge to the other part of our conversation, right? Which is about activism. So, Nakaya, in your sort of remarks right there, you noted that, that there's a controlling of a narrative that happens, that in the data, or data science is a part of that. But I'm wondering, I'd love to hear either one of you both talk a little bit about, the role of activism then in these conversations. So actually, let's start from a fun question. What is an activist? What does that mean, right? to be called an activist in the first place?
I think we're all still trying to figure that out. It means very different things to very different people. During my time, I'm a very outspoken. I'm confronting rules. I'm learning rules to break the rules. And that's how my activism works best. But I've had to share with people that over the years, we know that people who fed the movement during the civil rights movement, people who are handing out water so that you can protest, that's their activism. That's what they know how to do best. And it's really trying to define and carve in your space in this world and where you feel comfortable showing up. And it may not be on the front lines, it may be behind the scenes, but if, let's say, the women of the civil rights movement who fed the movement, if they hadn't been there, the individuals on the front line wouldn't have had the energy. So, that the revolutionary characteristics of what activism looks like, we all really play such an essential role in that. And acknowledging that, I think, too, is how much further along we can get, once we come to those realizations that everyone can play, the role based on what they're comfortable with.
Thank you, Renee.
Sure, thanks a lot. Well, you know what, Syria, I will say this. I've really never seen myself as an activist, although most of my life I've been referred to that as an activist. I think for me, it's just always been about doing the right thing. And maybe that's how I ended up in the criminal justice system. And that's how I ended up working as a criminologist, because it always comes back to just doing the right thing. And I always believe that, the time is always right to do that. I think when it comes to data activism, what I'm learning is that because data is now power, and because data is now so powerful, that we have got to really be on the front line as to what is happening with data. One of the things that we're seeing, and we know that we can use data now to really affect social and political change. And this is why it's so important. And given the fact that new and emerging technology is really creating so many different systems that are now impacting other systems that were more traditional systems, you would find that data activism is so critical at this moment. Not only does it speak to the kinds of moral principles that are required to ensure that new and emerging technologies such as AI are done in ways that really protect your civil rights and of course your data rights. It also is about understanding the kinds of ways in which we can transform society for the better and for everyone to be included. So data activism is definitely very powerful and goes hand in hand with AI ethics, because this is the moment in which we stand. And I think we all need to be co-producers of our future. And just given the transformative power and the promise and the pervasiveness of technologies such as AI, it is so important that we understand the kind of power our data holds and why it is we need to all be activists when we think about privacy and security, and of course, questions such as accountability and transparency, and just the need for us to create a technology that is responsible and inclusive and trustworthy.
I want to focus in on the we part because, at this point, I've heard you both say we, right? This collective pronoun, which is one of my favorite words too. But, how do we get to the we piece? I feel like, and this could just be my impression, but sometimes data science, it feels very far away from, my day-to-day life or from my, or feels far away from our understanding of the world. So how do you grow activism in a space that may not feel accessible to so many folks? How do you create that we in that kind of context?
I can take it. Well, it's this. One of the things that I always say is, yes, we need more literacy around data and, of course, more literacy around AI, but we're all producers of data. And as producers of data, we've all got to be cognizant of the fact how our data is being monetized. And of course, in situations where our data could also be weaponized against us. I think one of the things that we've got to do is democratize data. And that is why community data is so critical to the ways in which we are thinking of reimagining data. I think we also have to appreciate the fact that we are producers of knowledge. And most of us don't think about that. When we think about how our data is being used, or how our data is being used to create the kinds of policies that may include and may exclude us. So I think the collective we is that we're all a part of this technological space. We're all producing data. We're all using data to do the things that we want to do. But it really is about inclusion. And this is why I think I speak so much about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because we've got to bring everyone into the mix. Because if it is the data is used to measure, and if it is the data is used to count, we want to ensure that we are including and counting everyone, because it is that kind of accuracy that will give us the best kind of policies, from criminal justice to healthcare, to education, to finance, just about every area. So we are, the we that has to really at this moment take charge and to play an active role in what is happening with the ways in which we are collecting and analyzing and using data to deploy our technology.
Thank you. I'm wondering, oh, sorry, you're gonna go ahead. I'm not gonna ask another question then. Go ahead, Mayor Walker.
I just wanted to add to that, part of what that we looks like is who are actually the experts, right? And so for so many years, FAR just created Residents for Respectful Research. And they created that because of the toxic relationship between the University of Virginia and the public housing communities, and how they use the public housing community and children within the Charlottesville school system from the public housing communities for data purposes that we could not tell you what all those purposes have been in the past. So they now have a staff member who is charged with, making sure and approving research done on public housing residents. A lot of people years ago, when we would counter the narrative that they had come up with, they would tell us that we were wrong, that our lived experience, what they had produced and compiled, topped our lived experiences. And so part of that is coming to terms with who the actual experts are and acknowledging how it has been used in the past to tell a story, to abuse, to manipulate, and how do you build that trust in communities, especially in communities that you say that you want to serve. I remember 2012-ish going to Harlem Children's Zone, and their staff members talking about like total control over the data that came out of that and the restrictions they had placed on Columbia University, and with telling the narrative from some of that data. And we sat around that table, and I had talked about this in Charlottesville, and now we were sitting in New York around the table, and I'm tapping one of my co-workers on the list, like, this is exactly what we are talking about, in Charlottesville. But Harlem had, put its foot down, Harlem Children's Zone. They said, absolutely not. You will not tell the story about our children, about our families without us approving it. Because most of the time that story that was told was in a negative light. And once you portray people and characterize them only through that lens, what does that do to their spirit? And they understood that, and Charlottesville is still attempting, even in 2022, to come to terms with what does that, those type of labels, what does that piece you put up based on the data that you capture, what does that do to the spirit of a people? And we are not there yet, but hopefully that we could build that.
Thank you. And, we have a question that I do want to go ahead and bring in here because I think it fits well. Sharon is asking about, what you've seen in terms of engaging people and how their data is being used. I think this is a particularly good question, especially thinking about the things that, Mayor Walker just shared. And I'd love to hear from both of you on this. And Nakaya, when you speak, I'd love to hear your perspective on what you've seen in this community, as well, even from a policymaker standpoint, right? On how local government is using data and community data to tell their stories. So I know I said a lot of words there, so I'm going to repeat the first part of Sharon's question, which is, what are the best examples you've seen in terms of engaging people and how their data is being used?
Sharon, thank you so much for that question. And I think the jury's still out on that because it's one of the big questions right now when we're thinking about data activism is how do we engage communities around the conversation of data? There have been several frameworks that have been designed. I know recently, last November, I was part of a discussion with the strategy used by New York City when they launched their AI strategy. And the challenge is there still needs to be a requisite level of data literacy that is not there. So a lot of people are still not speaking about data in the ways in which we may be speaking about it, but the conversation has started. So when it comes to community engagement, I would say that we've got to let communities understand the power of their data. We've got to let communities understand that we are the producers of knowledge. We've got to let communities understand what that data is doing and how that data becomes information, which is turned into intelligence, which is turned into policy. And we've got to get communities more involved in the conversation. I think lots of different groups have been reaching out. Within the realm of surveillance and law enforcement, you're finding that the impact of these technologies in our underserved and high needs communities is really creating a lot of conversation there. particularly surveillance. And you would find there are many nonprofits that may be creating a more dynamic space for conversation. But if there is like a standard operating procedure and how do we engage communities, that does not exist. What we are seeing is that we need to get more creative. And actually, this is something that I've been thinking about and I have been working with in my head, which is myself, of course, trying to come up with a kind of toolkit for community engagement within the realm of public interest technology and ways in which we can do this in a much more dynamic and real-time way. So to answer your question, there is no standard, but one needs to be created, and it's a discussion that needs to be had just a little more vigorously.
I agree with all of that. You know, one of the things that I advocated for every day during the campaign and during my entire term was creating an office of performance measurements. We give away millions of dollars and we do not know where that money is going. We do know that the conditions that we're supposed to be trying to solve still exist. And they exist after programs have been in place for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. They exist. And I wouldn't have expected to get that much pushback on creating this office and staffing it so that we can start saying, this million is worth giving here, this million isn't. And what I found out to be true was that our city was more interested in protecting the jobs of the individuals who worked at these nonprofits versus really solving the issues that have been created by being worked and growing up and living in this community and the effects that poverty have had on people in this world-class city. So that is one of the things that is, so we're not even at the community engagement piece yet, because we haven't even acknowledged the fact that the good we think we're doing isn't serving anyone. So we haven't gotten better at serving people well because we haven't acknowledged that part yet.
I love that you said that because you gave me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that I did in fact read the book, Why We Can't Wait. And so I'm going to demonstrate that now with a quote that I think fits well right here and is a sort of a good conversation piece here. And it's a question about direct action. So in the book, Martin Luther King Jr., he sort of says to the reader, you may well ask, why direct action? And he talks about this as seeking to create such a tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about data science and justice. I would love to hear from y'all your thoughts on, on data science or data as, as a piece of that, right? As a, is there a potential bridge? Can data be used to do that, to create this tension that he describes that will force us to confront an issue in the way that Mayor Walker was just describing?
Well, I think data is already creating that tension, because one of the things that we're seeing would be a lot of direct action within the space of bias and discrimination when it comes to, let's say, AI and algorithms. And we're seeing that we need to reimagine data, because historically data has created some of the systems that are not working for us anymore, the stereotypes that are still finding its way into the ways in which we are designing and developing and deploying technology. And much of the layers and levels of bias and discrimination baked into our data sets are coming from that past history in which Dr. King, of which Dr. King refers to. I think data is definitely a negotiating tool in 2022 and as we move forward. And this is why data activism is so critical when it comes to thinking about social and political change and ways in which we can use data in the public interest. So definitely when we think about data science has a critical role to play in the ways in which we are thinking about justice. And of course, ensuring that due process is protected and ensuring that equity is on the table as we design policy or as we deploy technology.
And one thing I arrived at reviewing that text again is how far along we have not come and how much data do we need, because we're still having the same arguments that we have had for hundreds of years, and in the context of this, a lot of decades. And so at what point do you stop needing more and you understand that we are not growing and getting better, that we are still attempting, and maybe that's part of the argument that's just popped in my head. Maybe we haven't had the data that we needed to change. I think the people whose lives are affected by this would say something differently, but it's just like, how much evidence, because that's really what we're trying to produce, how much evidence do we need to say things haven't changed, they're still the same, and as a result of this, this is what people's lives look like. Because that's what, hopefully, if you're having discussions and using words like data activism, data justice, then you are trying to help people's lives improve. You are trying to make this world a better place. And as you read and review, you just see the consistency in the struggle. And that's what people are exhausted by. I'm exhausted by it. Let me say. I feel because I feel like I need to make that statement.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask one more question and then I'm going to turn to the chat. And I'll also be inviting some of our folks, because we did say it was going to be a conversation, some of the folks who are joining us to camera on and join us in the conversation. And so this sort of final question coming from me is going to be a question about liberation, right? Like, Nakaya is talking about, what about exhaustion, which I'm right here with you, but also about what is it all for? I love this question that you just asked. How much data do we need, right, to come to a place of action? But what is it all for? For what? For this question of liberation. I really would love to hear from Renee and Nakaya. What does even the question of freedom or liberation look like in the context of data science? What does justice, look like in the context of data science, which, we sometimes think of as being very technical, right? But what do these things mean when we're talking about that here? I know that's a big question to have tossed out there towards the end.
Well, I think on the question of liberation, hold on, I think my video went out there, hold on. Not sure what's happening with my video.
It just makes it sound even more special, Renee, like when we can't, it's like a disembodied voice.
Okay, so I don't know why my video decided not to, so the question of liberation, I think one of the things that we are seeing now with data science is how important it is for democracy and for the advancing of democracy. What we're also seeing with data science and liberation is that data science is so westernized that we need to start to include other perspectives. So there's a movement that speaks to the decolonization of data and embracing more of a multicultural perspective that really looks at the contributions, of course, of our First Peoples, indigenous data, our native peoples, the African continent, really thinking about ways in which we need to rethink the data and rethink the ways in which we've been using data to design policy. When we think about liberation movements, we're seeing that many of these movements are now using data science and using technology to really, the revolution is happening on the internet. We have seen that in many different ways. So when it comes to this whole concept of data liberation and freedom, it really comes back to giving voice and who has that voice and how we are using voice and just giving liberation movements the tools to use data to sort of free themselves from the restraints that have been keeping many of movements behind. Of course, there's this concept of digital activism and how that correlates with liberation. And your other question, Siri, is about this data justice just in general and how are we supposed to conceptualize that? I think we conceptualize that for everyone. And that understanding that questions such as privacy and freedom of expression and the ability to gather in a public space and the ability just to self-actualize and the ability to be the architects of our destinies and who's creating our legacies. And I speak a lot about the transmission of intergenerational trauma through data and how the ways in which we are using data could be undermining or is undermining the legacies of many communities. Because when we think about algorithmic decision-making systems and the kinds of decisions that are made, we don't often know when an algorithm makes a decision against us or when we are denied an opportunity or when we are denied access. So we've really got to think about data justice and the fact that we need to bring equity to the kinds of legacies that are being created. And we've got to pay attention to these long-term impacts of data. And this is why AI ethics is so important, to create those guardrails around the ways in which we are thinking about technology and deploying it, and thinking about who's designing it, and thinking about the kind of culture around the design, and thinking about who's being included. And this is why it is so important to bring a justice-oriented approach to data, because if we don't do that, we are building futures and legacies that are excluding generations, and we just don't want to do that again. We've seen that playbook at work, and I think if we're thinking about using AI to transform society and to transform lives, then we want to ensure that everyone is included in that process.
And when I hear liberation and data, I have more questions than probably answers. But what I think I know for sure is that we have to figure out what that balance needs to look like. One of the things that popped in my head while Renee was talking was when HIV was a white gay male disease. No one said in that moment, let's wait for X number of years to compile the data. They said we need to triage this situation. You still collect it, but you provide resources to it immediately to resolve it. And then you try to figure out how you do it better. We saw that change once it was no longer white, gay, and male. And those, when I think of liberation and data, I'm thinking of when we do more providing the immediate resources that's needed and continue the study versus allowing things that have persisted for generations to persist, and that destruction that it brings to people's lives while we're providing. So I have just a lot of questions. Those two, data liberation, it wasn't fusing very well.
Thank you both. I want to respond to a couple of the questions in the chat, and then we'll see, if our friends in the room with us have some thoughts or some wonders as well. So there's a question here in the chat from Robin that I think is getting to, how some of the tools that come out of places like a School of Data Science can be used to benefit others more quickly. And so I would, if either one of you has a response to something like that, do you see that there's a lot of tools that are coming out that are actually being put to the benefit of people very quickly, or do you see other avenues to do so? I hope I'm getting your question right, Robin. So, if I'm not, then speak up.
Okay, Siri, I'm a little bit lost. Could you repeat that for me?
Yeah.
I think I can answer it, but I want to make sure that I got it.
Yeah, so I think that our question is about how these, tools that come from places like the School of Data Science or, other data science professionals can be used to the benefit of people quickly, which I think is coming a little bit to your point previously about the lag sometimes between information and action.
And I just want to make sure that I heard all of that. So I basically, what I would have to offer to that question is what I shared before, just that we need to figure out what that bridge looks like between individuals' lived experiences and the data that is usually needed. Because what I have found in the space, nonprofit realm, and working with the city, is that we're doing all this because we need people to fund it. We need to prove to people that we deserve the money to continue to do this thing. And then once you gather the evidence, you need the money to carry out whatever you're going to put in place. Typically, those groups of people are very different people. And I've also found like the theory of a thing doesn't always translate into what needs to be done in that activist space. And having more of those conversations with individuals impacted and that are on the ground doing the work probably would push us further along to shorten that time frame to get the results that ultimately we all want.
Thank you. Okay, so for the folks who are in the room, first off, would love to see your faces. I mean, Paul, I appreciate seeing your face. But if there are any other faces that would like to share, yeah, here they come. I love it. This is my favorite part. It's like a big reveal, right? It's like a little advent calendar of Zoom room, folks. There's a prize behind every window here. So, we would like to, keep this a conversation. And so that really does mean opening it up so that we can ask some questions, but you don't have to feel like you have to have some really well thought out, well articulated question. We can also kind of wonder aloud together, right? And sort of, have more of an exploratory thing. So who's feeling frisky and has a thought? It could be a response to something that was shared by our speakers, something you've been sort of marinating on for a while, any sort of thing you want to toss into the room here. Kristen? Yeah, come on.
I just want to thank Ms. Walker. I've been watching you from afar, and I applaud your standing up for everything that you have these past couple of years. It takes a lot of strength. Thank you. And I just also wanted to I guess point out something as I'm listening to all these stories is, it just really depends on the question that you ask for the data that you get, right? And so I think it's important when people are using data to ask the right questions and have people around the table that can help them figure out which data should be collected to give them the story. Because you could say two different things about the same, and have data to back it up, about the same story, depending on the question that's asked. And so I wondered what people thought about that.
Thank you, Kristen.
One thought that comes to mind is police reform that we have been discussing, and that's one place where you can ask very similar questions, and depending on which side of the equation you're on, you get very different responses, and you can use the same data sets. One thing that we found, especially over the past year, is that the increase in shootings in our community prompted people to look at some of the data. Some people were looking at, oh, the increase in shootings, location, what does that mean, and what needs to be done as a result of that. Most of the people who were looking at it from that angle, the what needs to be done as a result of that wasn't going to serve the community, and especially the most vulnerable members in the Black community, well at all. Then there were questions on those data sets about what fuels this level of balance. Where are people in their lives? What are they struggling with? That this is their response to this global pandemic. What does this mean about their pain, and how, from the space we're in today, can we help resolve it? Same data sets, but very different reasons for asking the questions and attempting to provide very different solutions after having those conversations. And it is critical, the who, as we all know. Who is asking the questions, and what do they hope to get out of it? So one of the responses that has come out of that is attempting to figure out how to provide more services, human services, to people in need. The other response has been press releases that say we have locked people up who shot guns in this area because they could have harmed people, and we are going to prosecute them to the fullest extent. Some of the same people having that second conversation were people who were just having conversations about how to mend what mass incarceration has produced. And so that's the example that comes to mind. And it's something I'm sure, I'm not in those rooms at this moment, but I'm sure it's a major struggle, because ultimately we all want the same thing. We want people to be able to live in healthy, vibrant communities. But what that means when you take the first approach, and you approach the situation from that promogenic standpoint and lens. And it's not about healing, it's not about serving, and it's not about meeting people where they are to assist them. And I saw what I thought was abuse of that data in those settings. And for a community who is saying it's headed in the opposite direction, that it understands the generational impact that the mass incarceration from this community from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, that we didn't want to travel back down that road, there was immediate return to that same thought processes, because people said people should just do better, without taking into account all the reasons why they have been in those situations in the first place. And that as a community, besides having the conversations, we haven't changed much.
Thank you. Renee, are you still with us?
Sure, I am. Just my video is not coming on, but that's okay. I think just to add to the question is, when we're thinking about data, we've got to think about always, who's doing the collecting of the data? What's the level of analysis? What is the context? So one of the things that we're seeing is that there definitely needs to be a lot more critical thinking around data. And this is why I will always speak to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why it is so important when we're thinking about analysis. to add to what Mayor Walker says, I mean, being a criminologist, we would appreciate that criminal justice data is some of the most controversial data that you can really ever use, because you can use the data to pretty much say whatever you want to say. But one of the things that we have seen with criminal justice data is that many of our criminal justice policies are really not the kinds of policies that are required. The mayor spoke about the context of many of, or the backgrounds, when we think about something like violence and gun violence. We've got to always think about context with data. And this is why it is so important that individuals who are collecting that data, who are analyzing that data, who are, doing anything with data, understand the different layers and levels of questions such as bias, or how a history of enslavement, or a history of just oppression finds its way into our data sets, and how do we remove that. So some of the work that I'm doing right now within the realm of the transmission of intergenerational trauma through our data really looks at that history of trauma, particularly in communities of color, and how do we try to mitigate that in our data sets.
Thank you. And thank you, Kristen, for stepping into the fray first. Who is going to join them? I can feel someone would like to say something. Just wonder aloud, even a response. I'll buy you some time because I have Stephanie. Okay.
Yes.
Go on, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Walker and Ms. Cummings. With data, I guess what always comes to mind, and I know everyone has thought about this, and it's an issue we're all trying to fight, but it's, how that data is collected. That's very important, because we have a lot of, low-income families, a lot of different cultures, backgrounds, languages, elderly, homeless people, just all different groups of people, and getting data, having all those people included, having enough money and enough resources and people to go out, volunteers or whatnot, to obtain the data needed. So I guess going back to what you guys are saying is, not only is there the need for it, but how do we get the most accurate data to be able to help all those different groups? So that always, it's in the back of my mind. It's like, we have so much data already, and a lot of it, is helping for our purposes, but there's always, that gap. Something's always missing. Somebody's always missing. How do we reach out to them? You almost want to be that person, going house to house saying, hey, I'm here to help you. We have these funds available. We have people that are willing to help, but how do we make that happen? So that's always just lingering. It's something that always comes up, especially with, with data that's already been collected. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I know probably a lot of people have thought that, but it's just something that I always think, like, man, there is all these groups of different people that we just have not been able to reach out to and obtain, the information that we need from them.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stephanie. I think that's great. And I think your comment is probably also related to some of what Jessica here has put in the chat, that I think building off of that. Jessica Stern, thought you were safe in the chat, but I'm calling you calling you out loud. Do you want to share your thought in the chat here, building off of what Stephanie said?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate Stephanie's comment too. And I was curious about the discussion of context. So I study child development, and as a psychologist, I'm always thinking about how do we actually quantify some of the layers of context in which a child might grow up. So there are some amazing sociologists who have created these indices of neighborhood level racism, but there's also, socio-historical context in there. And I was just wondering how we start to quantify those and kind of build them into these AI models.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that's a great question, and I don't have the answer to it, right?
And it's an excellent question. And myself, as I said, coming from a background of sociology and psychology, those are the things that I've been thinking about. And there are, we're starting to think about it in AI, and that's why it's so important for AI and just technology in general to have these kind of collaborations. So this is why we see that, interdisciplinary collaboration so critical to data science. So this is why we need the psychologists and the sociologists and the educators and the social workers and the ethicists and the philosophers all involved in the ways in which we are thinking about technology and data. So an excellent question. And of course, this is the moment for this type of collaboration, research collaboration to happen.
And I'm going to take what Renee said, I'm going to co-sign, I'm going to take it a step further and say, and at the School of Data Science, I mean, Jessica, I'm going to extend you an invitation right now, right? Because this school is founded on this concept of being interdisciplinary. And to Renee's point, the very kind of question that you're asking, it's not a question that's going to come from any one place, right? It's going to take more of that we stuff that we were talking about. So I'm not going to forget you asked it. I'm going to track you down on Outlook. So we'll follow up. Other thoughts, or anyone here who has who's been thinking about the same thing that Renee and Jessica have been thinking about and has something to add to it? Melissa.
I've been trying to decide how to ask my question, but I can't think of any other words, so I'm just going to say it as it's in my mind. I feel like, especially the more historical data, but even now, depending on who's giving surveys and for what reason to collect data, I feel like that it's all whitewashed. Not all, but there is a lot of it that is whitewashed. And is there a way that we can recover from that, like historically, as we're doing data and data comparisons, to history to find trends? Like, we can't just start over, obviously, but how do we look at historical data, but I'm not saying take it with a grain of salt. I can't decide how to say what I'm trying to say, but we all know that, if we're being honest, his data is whitewashed. So how do we get past that?
I think you can say what you just said, because we said that a little bit at the beginning about why was this data collected in the first place? What is it being used for? What was the intention behind it? So then the narrative that is being told from it, there is a foundation for that. And we do know that for most people, that has not been a positive experience. I have a story because I always have stories, but I used to work for the City of Promise. And City of Promise was created. I was the second employee to be hired when that was started back in 2012. And what we had to do was to go out and get surveys answered. And, we gave a stipend. But one of the things we consistently heard was how many surveys this community was being asked to complete, even though the individuals from our nonprofit world and from the university had learned you give some type of incentive to get this thing done. People still knew that a lot of people were asking them these same questions, and then they never heard the outcome, which is part of the reason why FAR created this position. The Public Housing Association of Residents created this position that it created. But in survey development, one of the things that I found out is the people who you are going to typically ask that question are typically excluded, which doesn't make any sense. And then when you are attempting to administer this survey, yes, we've arrived at the point of the incentive, but we have not hired people who are the people who would be affected by the outcome of the survey to administer the surveys. And so those were just two very small things. So you have people in the room. When I would go up to people with the survey, when people said, I don't like that question, I would say, how should I have asked you this question? And so I changed it. And then we had that conversation about why this needed to be changed. Now, let me tell you, we were trained by YouthNext at UVA, and you don't change questions on the survey. So it was not well received. But having the conversation about the fact that people don't like this question, and we either need to change it or we need to take it off. And then this is how they feel about the level of like survey saturation that they experience in this community. So that's just a starting point to even attempt to get to a place where we are asking people just questions on a just survey that actually leads to healing of individual and community. I mean, I don't think we're at that point. I don't have the answers for that. Those are things that I've been grappling with for a long time too. But the participation of the individuals affected is something that doesn't take a lot of effort that we can change immediately. And that will change some of the questions that you are, the question that you are posing about how this thing is whitewashed, how do we undo this thing?
And just to add that, I will just add the historical data is creating a lot of risks when it comes to AI. And what we're realizing as we look to detect and mitigate those risks with other technological tools, or other data science tools, we're seeing that it's going to take more than technology to course correct. What it is going to take is each of us who are in the space understanding that history and being more critical in our approach to the ways in which we are thinking about data. So it's acknowledging the past, understanding it, and trying to find ways to mitigate that, technological as well as our thinking. So that's the approach at the moment when we think about AI ethics.
Thank you. Now, I'm just noting that we are at 101. And so folks who, need to drop off, please do not feel shy about doing that. I hope Mayor Walker, Ms. Cummings, do we have room for one more question? Because I'm just getting vibes like there's someone who has a seat. There's already a hand up. I knew it. Come on ahead, Dr. Smith.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday to everyone as well. Excellent discussion, Renee and Mayor Walker and team. I think you're hitting the nail on the head when we talk about data and using data to improve not only service delivery, but in terms of providing access to different opportunities to support our community needs. From the fire department perspective, certainly we look at equity in delivery of medical services and certainly fire prevention strategies, and utilizing data in a community-driven approach in terms of our risk reduction. But one of the things that I wanted to point out or talk to the team about, elaborate on a little bit, has to do with the discussion about validity of the data and ensuring that the construct validity is there, and also ensuring that the reliability of the tools that are being used are appropriate for the type of data that we're looking to collect. And how do you do that? And how does AI influence that? That's really my question to Renee or the Mayor Walker.
Well, thank you so much for that question. Is it Dr. Smith? Let me say to you, I am not a data scientist. I'm a data activist, but it's an excellent question. It's something that I've looked at, reliability and validity, particularly within the realm of criminal justice data, as we were designing intelligence-led strategies to policing. What we've realized in AI is because we're designing these algorithms, and we all know about the black box challenges when it comes to algorithms, and the fact that algorithms and AI in general is the question of opacity. And of course, if there's opacity, how are we going to have reliability and validity, right? So these are questions that are happening in the now. And this is why conversations like these are so important, because in AI, we're speaking about trustworthy technology. We're speaking about accountability and transparency and of course, explainability. But how do we get this with a technology where opacity is the main construct? So excellent question. I don't have the answer, but these are the discussions that need to happen. So this is why the collaborations are so critical at the moment. So it's just an excellent question, and we've got so much work to do. So I'm hoping this conversation moves off of this Zoom space and into another space, Siri, where we can probably bring the collaboration together to come up with some answers.
Awesome, thank you. And then Mayor Walker, you talked about surveys and individuals not feeling like the survey is appropriately structured in a way that it's meaningful to them. And I would encourage you to maybe, and I would think that the UVA could provide some method or resource to support an analysis of the surveys after the information has been collected, to really examine the questions for that construct and reliability through whatever statistical tools that they have available to them, to ensure that the questions are measuring what they're intended to measure ultimately. And if they're not, which questions maybe need to be removed or edited in some manner.
I like how you low-key snuck in a job for us. I appreciate that. Mayor Walker.
Yeah, and I mentioned YouthNext, which is a department at the university. So the survey that I was thinking of at that time, we did have the expertise that was in the room in those moments present, which also goes back to the, who is in charge and what is the outcome, and, really what that foundation looks like. But Dr. Smith, Chief Smith, made me think of something too. What does that action look like? Dr. Smith came on as the fire chief, and so sorry if you didn't want me to use you as an example, but you just presented me with the opportunity to do so. And you're talking about a profession that is in most places, and in Charlottesville, Virginia, almost all white and all male. And so instead of needing to collect and say, oh, this is it, data, this is where we are, and spend, 2, 3, 5 years analyzing that, Dr. Smith immediately started looking at who do we have on staff and how do we change that, and recruited the most diverse group in the history of new hires in the history of the fire department, that included Black, other people of color, and women. And so that action, when you have the lived experience, he's there, he's on the scene daily. How can I immediately change this versus how much time do I need to analyze this thing? And also, how does that transform the individuals who are serving the community, who will now be serviced by individuals who they can identify with through race? And we know that people, based on historical patterns, immediately feel they are going to receive better care, and there's someone, whether that thing is true or not, because again, they're just meeting these individuals too, but someone will provide me better care because they understand where I am coming from. So back to why we're here today, the why we can't wait, the sense of urgency that having your staff, which are responding to emergencies in community, and for a lot of these emergencies, they are health emergencies, and they are health emergencies that Black people who have suffered in this community for a long time is having. Now, there's no data to say, oh, this is changing things in Charlottesville, Virginia yet, but that action has occurred to hopefully later produce the data that says that they were great hires and this was a great move, on the fire chief's part. So how do we triage, and then all of the fancy stuff that people need to say you triage in the right way, how do we then get that? I think that provides a good example.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we are at 1:09. I'm gonna give a last call. Well, it's not really a last call. Oh, Liesl, I had a feeling that was gonna be you. Let me give my wrap up thoughts and I'm gonna turn that over to Liesl. I think, just amplifying what Renee said about taking this conversation outside of the Zoom room. The School of Data Science is today's sponsor, but really, our invitation is for everyone here to be looking at us as a potential partner, friend, and collaborator, because we know that, we're in this work together. And so there will be other conversations to be had, but there will also, in our follow-up email to everyone who has participated today, there will be an invitation for you to connect with us so we can continue on. And now, Liesl of the beautiful blue skies background, give us the final thought for the afternoon.
It's really a very boring Venetian blind behind me, but I like to spice things up. Yeah, no, I guess throughout this whole conversation, I've been thinking about, the only term I can think of it is like the curators of data, who is in charge of, has been talked about gathering it, designing the questionnaires, but then also deciding what to do with it. And who's making the judgment calls when data is somewhat observational, which I work for the Shelter for Help in Emergencies. So we have all these demographic questions that we answer every time we get a hotline call. And many of them are optional. And many of our hotline calls are crisis situations or close enough that you can't ask all the questions. But some of them aren't optional. So who's making that judgment call when I'm trying to just guess someone's age because I didn't have the time to ask them, and just built-in bias that way. But it all sort of speaks to me of this thing that I can't get out of my head, which is I feel like a lot of the social injustices that data could help us address are somewhat obvious already, and we don't actually need as much data as we're asking for to justify making the changes. And we're not going to get the data that's going to justify making those changes until we've already begun to make those changes. So it's sort of like a who came first, the chicken or the egg. If we don't diversify our staff and volunteers and and have a significant understanding of historical and intergenerational trauma and injustice, then we're not really going to be able to gather and interpret the data that would then prove the need for more of that. It's sort of I guess I've heard Mayor Walker saying this a lot, that we have to act without the data. And a lot of these problems to me are already so present. And I'm like, do we need more data to prove that there are inequities, or is that just something we've known for literally hundreds of years in our community and could just start to address? And I don't want to ignore the value of data in terms of challenging assumptions that we make based on our experiences that are limited and things like that. But I also think sometimes it's glorified as this answer that's going to tell us how things are, and really it's telling us things we already know, and the same people are ignoring those things, and the same people are trying to get them paid attention to. And that's really the base of the problem.
So I'll jump in first, and then I'll let Renee close it out. But I have been sitting on this conversation today, and I've had people like Siri, but listening to Renee today and just thinking how much more work I would have been able to accomplish had I had, if we were on the same team during this time. And so it's important to have the right people on the team to get the work done that you're attempting to get done. If you're listening to us, we arrive at the same place, but we get there very differently. And that's because of how we even arrived at this point in our lives. But based on what the world is asking for, that, as you heard from some of my statements, I don't always agree with, because I think we know what we just need to do and we need to figure out the rest later. When you have the right people in place, it really makes, a tremendous difference. And some of the questions that even you are asking, Stephanie asked, I don't necessarily know we would be asking those questions if people who were authentic and intentions were pure were doing this work, together. And we're back to that we. The we has to shift a lot so that we are, more effective. And we are learning that, I think we already know that, but enough people are in positions of influence to challenge the norm. Not everywhere, but we definitely have them present in this community to start hopefully changing that a little bit faster.
And just to end that, I would say that one of the things we realize now is just the collection of public data is in crisis. People are not doing surveys anymore. The census takes about how many, when we think about census data, it's like 5 years after the census, then we're using the data. So there's a major crisis when it comes to collecting public, of course, community data. When it comes to the question of data, we don't need data to tell us what we need to do. But what we're seeing is that 4 or 5 big private companies are now owning all the data that's being used to create the kinds of policies that we are getting moving forward. And that's the challenge, because government is now accessing data from the private sector to also make those decisions. So if it is that we have a history of systemic racism, or we have oppression and enslavement and all of those things baked into our data sets, what we don't want to use is new technology to replicate old biases and old stereotypes. And that's what we're seeing with new and emerging technologies such as AI. So it's, what are we using the data to do? What are we using the data to design? And this monoculture of designers that may not look like all of us, creating those additional challenges of further bias and discrimination in our data set. So just bringing it back to data justice, the time is now for us to do what we need to do, and we need all of us involved in that process, because we've got to think of the long-term impacts, and we've got to think about what that future is looking like right now.
Thank you. That's a wonderful, I'm not going to call it an ending, we'll call it a pause point. Wonderful pause point. Until we all meet again, thank you so much to Renee and to Nakaya for your wisdom, for your words, and for sharing everything with us today. And thank you to everyone who participated in the conversation, for sharing your time and your insights with us as well. We look forward to the next time. Happy Monday, y'all.
Thank you, and thank you, Siri, for doing this for all of us. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And Renee, it was a pleasure.